Dr. Glenn Robinson. You see already information on the slide in front of you. Glenn retired in December as Professor of Defense Analysis after 30 years at NPS. Glenn continues his longtime affiliation with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UC Berkeley. His book, last year, Global Jihad, A Brief History, has been recognized as a best book of 2021 by both Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, a rare double award. He will be drawing on parts of that book for tonight's talk. Glenn has lived in, studied in, researched in, or visited virtually every country in the Middle East and North Africa, and most Muslim majority countries around the world. Glenn speaks and reads Arabic and reads Farsi. Tonight's program will be in Arabic. Glenn has just recently stepped down as our president for the past 2 years, and I'm sure other members of the board, as well as members, have noticed some significant changes in how we've approached our mission, and there's more coming. So you are a member of an exciting organization, and we're going to continue with that. Judith Glickman is our new president. She is at this time recovering from COVID, but we'll be hosting the August event that I just mentioned earlier. Glenn lives with his wife, Elizabeth, in Pebble Beach, where he had no idea retirement would be this busy. So this evening, after Glenn's program, we will have question and answers. We are not 200 people. Glenn has a good voice, but Elizabeth will carry a microphone around, as we've done in the past few events here, and she will hold the microphone just to be safe for any issues related to COVID. And we hope you enjoy Glenn's program, and please let's welcome Glenn Robinson. Thank you.
Doug promised more jokes than he delivered, so I think we're going to get more coming. I'm a bit of a wanderer when I talk, so I won't be pinched behind here. Anyway, it is great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to come speak. This was a wonderful organization to be a part of and to help lead the last couple of years. It's got a great board. It's doing some exciting things, shaking things up a little bit, trying to reach out to broader audiences, etc. So, as Doug said, there have been some changes already. There's more to come, but it remains just a terrific organization. So, I heartily recommend it to you. What I'd like to do tonight is to talk specifically about the last couple of chapters in this book, and as Doug said, it's gotten some nice recognition, which is outstanding. And specifically, talking about global jihad, I'll talk about these four waves, but it's this fourth wave, this fourth iteration of global jihad. It's the current iteration that I want to focus on tonight. Which is very much linked, you've seen this sort of growing, but very much linked to the internet. It's a form of jihad that is not possible without the internet and now social media. And so I want to sort of explain that as to why this form of political violence has so changed in recent years, and over the last 20 years or so, because of the internet. All right, so see if that works. There you go. So I will make a couple of arguments tonight. I'll even wear my glasses so I can see what I'm doing. The first is what I just mentioned, that this fourth wave. So global jihad is something that's been around since the 1980s, and I'll explain a little bit why. It's this fourth wave that is foundationally reliant on the internet, on new information technologies, as its sort of main vehicle for moving forward with its strategy and its violence. So the important thing here, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, is this notion of creating a system as opposed to an organization, right? Organizations can get rolled up by security forces, and they do. Systems are much more difficult to defeat. So we'll talk about that. That'll be the first set of comments. The second is I want to ask the question of, sort of so what? Where does this form of political violence fit into the larger universe of non-state actors who have engaged in political violence over the last century or so? And I'm going to make a provocative argument. It's an extension of work that Ken Jowett had done earlier, but make a provocative argument about a certain subset of violent political actors that you wouldn't think would normally sort of come together in the same conversation, but do in, I think, in interesting ways. So we'll get to that towards the end. So here's, if you're going to get the book, it's in the other room. Here's one slide that covers the first 75% of the book, so you can just kind of skip to chapters 4 and 5. What I try and do is say, look, global jihad didn't just emerge, out of thin blue sky. There's some background, there's some history here. Part of that history begins with the creation of what is called Islamism, Islamic fundamentalism, political Islam, etc. This is very much a 20th century phenomenon when we talk about Islamism or political Islam. You can date it, you can go back to 1928 if you want. What happened in 1928? This fellow here in the bottom left, Hassan al-Banna, founded the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Hassan al-Banna was an Egyptian school teacher. That becomes a bit of a theme here. So this goes on throughout much of the 20th century. By the 1960s, 1970s, there were the rise of intellectuals that come out of that Islamist tradition, which is a mostly nonviolent tradition. It's mostly grassroots, kind of social political organizing. There's not a bunch of peaceniks, but violence is not a cornerstone to the Islamist project. Creating some version of an Islamic State is, but not dependent on violence. In the 60s and 70s, a new sort of class of intellectuals said that didn't work. That the states are so corrupt, they're so entrenched, etc., that we need to use violence to overthrow them. We can't just do, the political, social, grassroots work is fine, but that's not going to change anything in a big way. So a rise of intellectuals that advocated violence in both, incidentally, it's interesting, in both the Shia and the Sunni world at the same time. You had these sort of different intellectuals using a different language, but advocating essentially violence to overthrow the state, to take power directly. And one of the most famous people in this regard is the fellow in the upper right-hand corner, Said Qutb, another Egyptian school teacher. There's a theme. He actually spent the late 40s, early 50s in the United States. And he radicalized in one of those sort of weird places to radicalize, which was Greeley, Colorado, which was incidentally a dry town at the time. But this was a major stepping. So he also spent some time at Stanford, so that's what I really blame for his radicalization. But anyway, so he is in many ways considered the godfather of Sunni jihadism. And he was hanged in 1966 by the Abdel Nasser regime in Egypt because of his radicalism, essentially calling for the armed overthrow of the regime. So it didn't end well for him. So you see this now, this jihadism beginning in the 60s, but really taking off much more in the 70s and the 80s. That's all locally focused. It's to overthrow the local regime, or to maybe fight over a little local patch of land. But you didn't see globalist arguments, sort of systemic international arguments that that's where the problem is. It was all locally focused. And then in the 1980s, you have the beginning of this kind of third stepping stone, which is the rise of a global vision of global jihad, or of jihad, that makes an argument that the big problem, whatever that big problem is, the big problem is systemic. It's at the international system. So it's not just one regime or one country or one little patch of land. It is a global problem, and it needs to be addressed through violence at the global level. So I talk about wave one, wave two, wave three. Wave one was in the 1980s. It came out of the Russian invasion or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The fellow, so in the middle right over there, where you see the Arabic Majallat al-Jihad, that is really the sort of the main ideologue, the godfather of global jihad, who made a first globalist argument. His name is Abdullah Yusuf Azzam. He was a Palestinian born in British Mandatory Palestine. Family went to Jordan in 1967 with the 67 war. And he was a very well-known Islamist, actually, in Jordan. He was a professor at the University of Jordan, tenured radicals. No, he didn't have tenure. He left the University of Jordan 5 years before I arrived at the University of Jordan, and he was still being talked about. I had no idea who he was when people would talk about him, but subsequently did learn, in fact, who he was. He ended up dying and being assassinated in 1989, but he made this first argument about occupied lands, occupied Muslim lands. So he would identify a dozen or so lands around the world, starting with Afghanistan. Then Palestine would be next on his list. And then after that, you could go different places. You go Kashmir in India, the 5 Central Asian republics at the time under Moscow's rule, Mindanao in southern Philippines, etc. So that was the first iteration, the first globalist vision of jihad. The second wave, all Americans are familiar with. This is Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Very different argument. And this is a wave that begins in the mid-90s, and essentially by 2003, it had been defeated. I talk about till 2011, which is when bin Laden met his maker in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This was not about liberating occupied territory. This was an argument, the bin Laden argument was about the need to overthrow these local, what he would call apostate regimes. And the only way you were going to do that was through getting what he would call the far enemy, getting the far enemy out of the way. And who was this far enemy? Was the United States. So if we drive the Americans out of the Middle East, so they get so fed up in the broader Islamic world, they just get so fed up with being involved and losing people, etc., then that would make those local apostate regimes that rely on Washington, he argued, much more vulnerable. So they could be overthrown. I like to compare it to remember the old Bobo dolls? Right, those. I had one growing up. They were great. They were about yay high, 4 feet high or so. Typically in a clown shape, and they were just plastic filled with air, but with a weight at the bottom. And you'd punch them, and they'd tip over, but then they'd right themselves right back. Right, and this was essentially bin Laden's strategic vision, such as it was, is that they could keep punching local regimes, assassinating Anwar Sadat or some other prime minister or whomever. They could give a punch, but that regime always righted. And he concluded it always righted because of the United States. And that was the problem. You drive the U.S. out. Now, next time you hit that Bobo doll, it's going to go over and it's going to stay over. In his thinking. He was incidentally roundly criticized by most other jihadis for this argument, and they blame him for much of the destruction of the jihad movement that came after the 9/11 attacks in Afghanistan in particular. All right, and the third wave that I talk about in the book is the ISIS caliphate. So this is not about, the first wave is about liberating territory. The second wave is about driving the Americans out of the region in order to weaken local regimes, really having nothing to do with the first wave. The third wave is the state building wave. This is trying to create this puritanical state in the heart of the Middle East. And when I talk about states, not a regular state. If I threw out the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, would I just hit eyes glaze over? Or? So our state system today that we have, with nearly 200 recognized countries around the world, is a Westphalian system. And this was, in 1648, a bunch of Germanic small states came together to make rules about how they're going to get along with each other. Why? Because up to that point, every state viewed itself as the only legitimate state around, and everybody else was an affront to God. Was illegitimate by definition. So they said, we probably shouldn't play that kind of a game. We'll just recognize that each other has basic legitimacy. We still might, fight and kill you and take over your territory, but the states would recognize each other as, legitimate parts of the system. And we're still living with that system 400 years or so later. The ISIS state was not a Westphalian state. It was a pre-Westphalian state. Right? Anybody remember when ISIS applied for a seat at the United Nations? Exchange ambassadors with any other country? No. They viewed themselves as the only legitimate state in the world. And so this diplomatic recognition and doing the UN thing and all of that, that was not for them. So they were very much a pre-Westphalian state. And I was just thinking about this afternoon. I can think of another example of a pre-Westphalian mentality that's very in the news today, and that is Mr. Putin's view of Ukraine. Right? He denies the very existence of Ukraine, its legitimacy as a country, the very notion of Ukrainians. He denies. He said this is just a fiction. Well, that's a pre-Westphalian kind of view of a recognized state with a seat at the UN and all of that. All right. The third wave, just sort of very briefly, there's a book on the bottom right-hand corner, Idarat Tawahush. Idara just means administration or management. Tawahush is the Arabic for savagery. And so the management of savagery, which has actually been translated into English. This was in the 2-year period following the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So 2003 to 2005 was the period of the most radical writings in jihadi history. So this book was published. Another book that I'll mention in a couple of slides was published in the same time frame. And it had to do with this, with how you utilize violence. Excessive, gory, over-the-top, performative violence, put it on the internet, all of that. So this is what we're going to see a little bit as well in the fourth wave, which let's just get to. So gets that out of the way. So the fourth wave, which is the one I want to focus on tonight, it begins with with 9/11 and the U.S. and coalition invasion of Afghanistan. To remove the Taliban and capture and kill as many al-Qaeda terrorists as possible. So that was kind of the specific event that led to this fourth wave, which was concurrent chronologically with the third wave, but again, very different origins, very different arguments, and sort of rationale for existence. This was a period of time, and in fact, this fellow here in the center, Abu Musab al-Suri, wrote about how the Americans don't even know how successful they have been in terms of killing all kinds of jihadis, maybe not bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, but sort of everybody below them. That the American counterattack in 2001, in 2002, early 2003, had been very successful in his judgment. In fact, so successful, he viewed that the global jihad movement was on the cusp of defeat. That it would actually it would be so defeated, be such a significant defeat that it would essentially go away, or at least go away for a long time. So he wrote, Abu Musab al-Suri, this red-headed guy from Aleppo, Syria, who had been involved in the first round of the Syrian civil war in the early 1980s, and then escaped, went to Spain, married a Spanish woman, got a little hot there, so he went to London, became a nice friend of Peter Bergen's. He's actually arranged Peter Bergen's interview with Osama bin Laden. You can see there in the bottom right, they knew each other well. So in 2003, 2004, on the run, he ends up in Pakistan, like a lot of other folks did. He writes this internet book that you see on the upper right-hand corner, Dawat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, The Call for Global Islamic Resistance. This is a 1,600-page internet book, very repetitive, quite boring in some cases, but extraordinarily influential. It's not been, there's been one chapter that's been translated into English, as far as I know, but the rest has not. It is this work that essentially informs this fourth current wave of global jihad. So let's talk a little bit about what that entails. So the key phrase to come out of Asuri and the people that followed on from him is that top phrase, Nizam la Tanzim. Nizam la Tanzim. So system, Nizam la Tanzim, not organization. And one of the things that he does in this very long book is to survey over the previous 40 years, so beginning in the early 60s, all these various jihad groups around the world. And he said, look, every one without exception has been rolled up, right? Eventually, they get rolled up by security forces. All you have to do is arrest one or two folks, torture them. They'll spill the beans on other folks, go arrest them, and in short order, the whole group is rolled up fairly successfully. So we can't do the same thing all over again and expect a different result. What we need to do is think about, in this very desperate time in his mind, need to create a system that can survive local security forces trying to roll them up. So that's what he is trying to do here, and it's a survival strategy. It's trying to live to fight another day. So global jihad can survive these very trying times. This is not a forever strategy, but it's an intermediate strategy to survive the current period. And there are three key elements to this vision. The first is what he calls jihad fardi. Jihad fardi. Jihad fardi means personal jihad. Not to be confused, there's another jihad nafs, the jihad of making oneself a better person, for example. Jihad has all kinds of different meanings. I'm using it in its military sense, the jihadist side, the jihad of the sword, so the violent jihad. But it has lots of other meanings that are not even religious. I mean, it's just a regular verb in Arabic, jahada. But personal jihad, so what does that mean? Planned organizational attacks are becoming harder and harder to do. What we need to rely on is individuals, motivated individuals, or maybe a small group of people, things that we call lone wolves today. We need to rely on them to carry out attacks. Well, how do they know how to do it and what to do? How do they get inspired to carry out an attack? And that's where the internet comes into play. So this is, again, this is the early 2000s. So people are starting to use the internet, think about how it can be used. Abu Musab al-Suri was one of the early ones to do that. He did cliff notes from the KKK, but we'll get to that in a minute. So he uses the Arabic term thaqafa, which just means culture, but he really means a narrative. You need to create a broad narrative about global jihad that can be shared and built on. So this, I make up the word wiki narrative. It's a wiki narrative in that it's an ever-evolving narrative that is not reliant on one or two or three ideologues who can be assassinated often very quickly, but thousands of ideologues that are working on their computers to morph and change and grow the narrative amongst, again, thousands of people, and so that new attacks can be woven in, can be stitched into this ever-evolving narrative to make the attacks that happen by these lone wolves or small groups seem a lot more powerful than they really, frankly, are in a sort of a cold, rational assessment. I mean, evil, killing and murdering some people, but not really representing a huge existential, even a large strategic threat. But you want to present it as though it does, right? You want to terrify people. And so you create this wiki narrative, again, that always is evolving. Where is it? It's online, right? It's online. And so I grabbed, this is actually an Indonesian jihad forum. And you see the computer and the I guess that's an AK-47, but with the ISIS flag. Well, as Ayman Zawahiri would say, half the battle is in the media, right? So half the battle, half the struggle is online. It's on the internet, getting out the message, inspiring people to join the cause and to take action. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. There's this third issue, which is the violence itself. So the form of violence is lone wolves, small groups that get radicalized and inspired online, and the narrative, again, that is in all kinds of fora gets constructed and reconstructed all the time. But now the nature of the violence itself. And Abu Musab Suri and his successors have argued for really gory violence against civilians, targeting civilians as soft targets, easy to hit. I have a theory I was never able to prove in the book, but I think it's true. Anybody read The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon? All right, so Frantz Fanon was born and raised in the Caribbean, went to France. He became the great ideologue of the Algerian Revolution against the French, 1954 to 1962. By the way, anybody know where he died? You'll appreciate this. Walter Reed. It's just one of those ironic things in life. Anyway, Fanon's argument about violence was pretty gory. That it had to be sort of a purifying form of violence. That it wasn't enough just to kill your oppressor. You wanted to kill your oppressor with your own hands, get his blood on your hands. And by doing that, it's a sort of a ritualized form of murder that helps purify yourself and overcome, the years or generations of repression. All right, and this was, Fanon was a very interesting fellow, but this was kind of his take in a simplified version on the use of violence in this revolutionary struggle in Algeria. Abu Musab Suri, this architect of the Fourth Wave, was a very well-read man on, he would read books on guerrilla warfare from Mao or out of Vietnam or elsewhere, Marx, Lenin, Che Guevara. It wouldn't have been Che. Maybe a little bit. Che was around at the very end, the last few years of his life. But he was a very well-read guy. In fact, he got criticized by other jihadis, the so-called Takfiri jihadis, Salafi jihadis, very puritanical jihadis. He'd be criticized for seeking wisdom outside of the Islamic canon. You can't learn from others. You have to learn only from within our own canon. And, he said, don't be foolish. There are things to be learned. I know Suri worked with the GIA in Algeria in the 1990s during this very awful, bloody, gory civil war in Algeria. The GIA with whom he worked was responsible for a lot of that gore. It's the same kind of gore that you saw with ISIS, 20 years later, The Algerian Civil War didn't get very much attention in this country, but ISIS in many ways replayed what the GIA had done in Algeria, the Armed Islamic Group. That's the French acronym for the Armed Islamic Group. So what I think happened is you had Fanon in Algeria in the 1950s, and then you'd have Abu Musab al-Suri in Algeria in the 1990s in that civil war, and he knew about Fanon in the 50s. And then that translates to ISIS and after that, the fourth wave of global jihad, this emphasis, I know it was a long kind of rabbit hole to go down, but this emphasis on performative, gory violence that you've seen more recently. I think that's its history. I think that's the evolution of where that came from. This is another rabbit hole I don't want to go down, but very briefly, Omar Mateen on the upper right there, he's the shooter that killed about 50 people in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. One could make a psychological, and I'll leave that to Peggy to do, a psychological argument about dealing with his latent homosexuality by shooting up a gay nightclub which he had visited before, that somehow by doing this and claiming it on a 9/11 call, claiming it in the name of ISIS was a form of personal purification at the same time, atonement for his sins, as it were. All right. So this kind of violence I just described, the lone wolf inspired violence. So this is violence where there is no connection, no direct connection between a group, ISIS or Al-Qaeda or anybody else, and the individual. It is inspired that, again, through the use of the internet, social media, that people are inspired to take up arms, some form of a weapon at that point in time. So stochastic, that's a fancy word. It's a word of probability. It's just a word of probability. And so the chances of something rising or falling. And in this case, in context, what it means is if there is a call that has gone out from a credible source to undertake acts of violence, you can reasonably predict over the next days, weeks, months, that the number of violence in the name of whatever the cause is will go up because that call has been put out. People take it seriously. Some people respond. The problem is you don't know who's going to respond, right? Who that week is going to get in a van and roll over a bunch of pedestrians down La Rambla or in New York City or anywhere else. It's very, very difficult to know who is going to be radicalized enough that week or that month. So again, you can predict that it's going to go up because this call will have inspired some people to undertake violence, probably, but you don't know who is going to be inspired that week. Sometimes you can get a good guess, and police, law enforcement have been pretty good at stopping some of these attacks before they happen, but a whole lot, you just can't do it 100% with 100% effectiveness. So basically all of the post 9/11 attacks in North America have been stochastic, inspired acts of violence, but with no logistical connection between the individual attacker and some mothership, some home group, again, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or anything else. So who is going to be inspired enough to read the Al-Qaeda online magazine about how do you create a kitchen bomb, create a bomb in your kitchen using a pressure cooker? Until the Boston Marathon bombing, right? By the two brothers that we do not think they had any ties to any particular organization. They were inspired to do their violence. So an act of stochastic terror. I talked about the Pulse nightclub a minute ago, or the Uzbeki man in New York City that got into that truck and then rolled over, and I think it was 8 bicyclists and killed them, injured a bunch of others. Again, no known connection to any group, but he was inspired to go and do that act of violence. Or the couple that decided they were going to go in San Bernardino into their office holiday party and shoot up a lot of their office mates. Again, no known connection that I'm aware of to any group, but again, an inspired act of violence. All right, so That's the common form today. The stochastic violence or stochastic terror. It's almost always terrorism because it's almost always directed at civilians. So who's this guy in the middle? All right, Thomas Metzger is his name. He just died a year and a half ago in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area, Hemet, I believe. But he lived for many years in Fallbrook, outside of San Diego in California. He was the sort of great ideologue of the KKK in the 1990s. And he and one of his partners were the first people to kind of think through how the internet could be used to get out the message, right? Get out the word, inspire people to join up and to act, to undertake actions, but do it in a way that you have sort of plausible deniability, right? First Amendment, this is just my beliefs. I didn't tell anybody to go shoot people or lynch them or whatever. I'm just, this is just my free speech rights. So he was the first guy to really kind of think through stochastic terror, he didn't use that phrase, but as we know it today. And it has continued, not only did have the global jihadis embraced many of his notions about how to use the internet to inspire, fear and loathing and terror. But white nationalists today have continued in that tradition as well. As we know, whether you're in Oslo or in Christchurch or in Buffalo, right, the same kind of stochastic violence, unconnected to any group, but inspired by sort of the same set of messaging around the internet, leads to horrific violence. All right, so let me just take a couple of minutes and say, sort of how does global jihad fit into, and especially this fourth wave, fit into this broader universe of violent political non-state actors over the last century or so? And I make the argument that the three major forms of political violence that we've seen over the last century, again by non-state actors, come in either the Leninist tradition, a national liberation, sort of third world liberation tradition, or even fascism, and this is a little bit more provocative, all rely on Enlightenment ideals. Leninism, right? It's the tip of the spear, the scientific unfolding of history. It was its very definition of progress. It embodied human progress in its own mind, at least. And there you see Mr. Lenin. All the national liberation struggles from Vietnam to Tunisia that could be more socialist or even somewhat Leninist or Maoist in orientation, or much more sort of nationalist bourgeois kind of independence in the case of Habib Bourguiba and Tunisia there on the right. But even fascism. So typically, fascism is introduced as the antithesis of the Enlightenment, a reaction to Enlightenment ideals, and there's a lot of truth to that. I don't want to dismiss that, but there's an element of fascism that has to do with human material progress that is in that Enlightenment tradition. Mussolini famously captured that sentiment when he talked about fascism is about making the trains run on time. Right? Human progress, making the trains run on time. Here is Mussolini in, part of what he would do was what we call it urban renewal, destroy neighborhoods in Rome and elsewhere, but primarily in Rome, in order to build huge boulevards and big monuments. If you've been to the Vatican and St. Peter's, you have that wonderful view down this open monument down to the Tiber River and the Castel on the left. You couldn't see that in 1936 because the Spina neighborhood was there. And this is a propaganda poster of Mussolini in the beginning the destruction of the neighborhood, again, to open up for boulevards and monuments and whatnot. So most non-state actors who engage in violence over the last century have done so in the name of some part of Enlightenment ideals. But there is a small group of folks, including the ones I'm examining in this book, that do not appeal to the Enlightenment at all. That is not what they're about. And this small group is really marked by these two characteristics that you see here. Nihilistic violence, and I mean nihilism in the political sense, like with these anarchists in the upper right-hand corner there. Nihilism in the political sense, which means root and branch violence, system-destroying violence, right? Over-the-top violence, as opposed to nihilism in the philosophical sense, meaning nothingness, right? This violence is not about nothing. It's about something, but it's a sort of way over-the-top response to whatever the problem is. So system-destroying violence, and that have an apocalyptic, anti-enlightenment ideology, and importantly, cultural contamination ends up being a feature, more or less, but a feature in all of these groups that I'm referring to as movements of rage, again drawing on Ken Jowett's earlier work. So these movements of rage have an element of cultural contamination, that there are sort of a fifth column. There are enemies within the educated elite who are betraying the real country, right? The real Kemmers, for example. I make up a word here that you see in the book, gnocicide, from gnosis, the Greek meaning knowledge, the Latin suffix side, meaning the killing of, so the killing of knowledge or the killing of those with knowledge. And that's one of the things you see in this kind of strange cluster of groups that you would not normally put together. But this is what typifies all of them, including that gnocicide, that cultural contamination element. So, what are they? Well, here are some other movements of rage. The exemplar in many ways is the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the second half of the 1970s that undertook a genocide that killed about 2 million or so of the population, which was almost a quarter of the entire population. Who was killed? The educated elite, and particularly those that lived in Phnom Penh, right, which was cleared out of people within the first weeks of the Khmer Rouge coming to power. Why? Because that was the site of cultural contamination. That's where all the contaminating elites lived that were betraying the pure Khmer society in their imagination. Red Guards in China a decade earlier had, I think, a very strong movement of rage element. There's, and Ambassador Lyon and I would disagree on this, but there was a lot of sort of Mao using the Red Guards for his own political benefit, which I absolutely agree with. But I think in origin they autonomously developed. They didn't need Mao to put them together and create a movement of rage type ideology where they focused their ire and violence on professors, on school teachers, on school principals, and again, any educated folks, primarily in Beijing. Boko Haram in Nigeria, before they got on the sort of global jihad bandwagon. The brown shirts in Germany, I think, are very interesting because why? Why Germany? This is an industrial country, right? The heartland of the industrial world at the time. In the 20s up to 1934, the brown shirts were the semi-literate, mostly rural men that were the thugs of the Nazi, that would protect Nazi parties, Nazi leaders. 1934, Hitler didn't need him anymore because he was in power, so the Night of the Long Knives, and he got rid of the brown shirts more or less. But it was the brown shirts that had with them sort of the grossest form of sort of genocide ideology, right? And again, it had to do with that good Germanic or Aryan society has been corrupted by these elites, these cosmopolitan elites. Who were the cosmopolitan elites in their minds? Mostly Jews, but also other folks as well that were corrupting the pure society. The gypsies, for example, homosexuals, those with handicaps, for example. So the inferior folks that needed to be gotten rid of in various ways, and of course that ends up influencing the other parts of that coalition, the German industrialists, the officer class in many ways, the Catholic Church, etc. And I would argue that, and here's a shot from Charlottesville a few years ago, elements of the white nationalist movement today constitute a movement of rage, in my judgment. All right, well, there we go. And there's some nice blurbs. So with that, let me thank you very much for your time and attention. I know this is a very uplifting, happy subject. But you know, you work for the Navy for 30 years. This stuff happens. So. All right, so Liz is going to go around. If you have questions, just catch your attention.
I'm going to start us off. What do you foresee for the future in terms of global jihad? Is this something we all need to lie awake at night and worry about?
I lie awake at night and worry about some things. What happens to Pakistan's nuclear weapons is one of them. It is, because of this form of political violence, the stochastic form of political violence, it's, the good news is it doesn't kill a lot of people, kills some, but doesn't kill a lot of people. The bad news is it's very, very hard to eradicate. So I suspect forms of it are going to be around for quite some time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have a question about the 4 phases of jihadism. How do they define the enemy? The enemy is sometimes, is it always the Western states, mostly United States, or is it also Christianity? Because I've read that they talk about crusades, that they want to take back those lands that Christians took over. So how do they define the enemy?
So the specific enemy varies from wave to wave. The first wave having to do with liberating occupied territories, all kinds of different enemies, depending on, so the Filipino government for Mindanao, the Indian government for Kashmir, the Israeli government for Palestine, Moscow for Central Asia. So lots of different enemies that would need to be defeated to liberate these occupied territories. And the second wave with bin Laden was very much the United States. And as allies to some degree, he would talk about that, the petty Jewish state, but that wasn't the problem. It was a subset of the problem, which was the U.S. So he was very, very much focused on the U.S. With the third wave, there really wasn't. This is the ISIS Caliphate wave. ISIS did not come out of the chute targeting Europe or North America. It didn't. In fact, it didn't start targeting Europe and North America until Europe and North America started targeting them and bombing ISIS. And then ISIS started its campaign abroad. So it wasn't so much a focus of an external enemy, at least initially. The enemy, I would say, for ISIS was apostasy, sinful behavior. That's what they wanted to eliminate in their own perhaps warped minds by creating this puritanical state and where temptations would not be allowed. So apostasy, sinful behavior, leaving the faith, taking actions that are against the faith, would be very difficult to do, if not impossible. It kind of reminded me. And don't quote me on this, but it kind of reminded me of 4th century Christian theology, the city of man, city of God distinction, where the whole point of the city of man was to protect the city of God so people could live out a fully pious, righteous life, right? And, this is figments of people's imagination. But there was a sort of a similarity, it seemed to me, in that regard. And in the fourth wave, again, it's a much more sort of diffused enemy and because they're not on the offensive in this fourth wave. It's very much a defensive posture of survival. That what do we do? How can we organize in order to survive? And then maybe in the future, things will be better, context will be better, and we can go from there. But this is just again a defensive survival mentality. Now, in terms of Christian relations, yes, these are the worst of the worst, right? These are people that would love to see all non-Muslims dead, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, you name it. And they, their behavior in their, so now talking about the ISIS state, their behavior in the ISIS state of, convert or leave or die, and sometimes they weren't really given the option to leave. It was convert or die. And again, this is very much antithetic to sort of traditional Islamic society, where we're talking about subjects, not citizens. But you'd have a categorization of subjects, but there was a traditional place for religious minorities without trying to exterminate them. Well, this is the extermination committee, so I wouldn't look to them for sort of liberal guidance here.
What do you see as the role for organized religion, Islam, in defeating these tendency towards jihad?
Very hostile, generally. There's traditionally very bad relations between the kind of jihadis I'm looking at and the ulama, the sort of high-level clergy in the Muslim world. So let me just give you two examples of that. Example one is how many high-ranking clerics in the Muslim world recognize the new caliph, the ISIS caliph? Zero. Absolutely none. So these guys tend to be very dismissive. And there was no love lost the other way either. So for example, Osama bin Laden would attack the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh bin Baz at the time, who's again one of the highest ranking members of the clergy, and he would go after him personally and saying, this corruption of the Saudi regime happened on your watch. You let it happen. How dare you? Well, this is kind of chutzpah, right? Not to mix my cultural metaphors. But there was no love lost, and there's still no love lost between the kinds of jihadis that I'm looking at and traditional clergy and sort of traditional institutions of Islam.
As a medievalist, I've never been able to escape the horrific pool of providence in our modern Christian world. And going all the way back, a lot of what you said, though, sort of struck me as a deep providential force in Islam, going deeply back and to this day still operating in one way or another. Does that make any sense?
I hope I didn't, because that would be misleading, in the sense that what I'm looking at is a phenomenon that is 40 years old, and it's not older than 40 years. The notion of jihad goes back to the beginning of Islam, and again it has different meanings. Fighting for the advancement of Islam or the protection of Islam, what one scholar referred to as missionary jihad, for example, where you conquer to save souls, etc. So that's, there's a whole kind of just war theory in Islam, just like there is in Christianity, that focuses on do's and don'ts in jihad. When can you do it? Who can declare it? Right. One of the things, for example, jihad in traditional Islam has to be declared by an appropriate authority. It can't be any Tom, Dick, or Harry that declares a jihad. Well, welcome to Tom, Dick, and Harry, right? These are not people that are qualified to declare a jihad, and yet, I'll give you a specific example. In 1998, Osama bin Laden and 4 other people write a fatwa, right? What is a fatwa? A fatwa is a religious opinion that clerics issue all the time. Bin Laden was the chief author. He was the first author of this fatwa, and he used the title of sheikh. Now, sheikh means different things, but it is, in this context, it means cleric, a high-ranking cleric. Bin Laden didn't even graduate from college, and he didn't even study Islamic theology, right? Abdullah Azam could. He was actually a cleric. He was one of the very few clerics. So, to my knowledge, he got such pushback. You know, this is false advertising, right? You're claiming to be a cleric, issuing a fatwa, which is only clerics can issue. You know, what a fraud you are, right? And he got such pushback on that. To my knowledge, he never used that honorific again for himself. His followers did. They would refer to him as sheikh, but he wouldn't refer to himself anymore after that adventure.
Hello. I'm going to take a moment to throw a rose. I read the book. Yay! And as someone whose mind is absolutely steeped in Western civilization, I did find the book an absolute tour de force in a much larger sense than just about jihadis of the entire contemporary, I will not call it modern, but contemporary Middle East, and he did not pay me to say this. Now, I
Checked in cash, I guess.
it just was very enlightening to me because it's not my lane. Very enlightening. I'm gonna preface my question with a quote exactly from your book. It has to do with the fourth wave, and you painted an extraordinary portrait of al-Suri. A very detailed psychological, what I would call a psychological portrait, characteristics. This guy's intelligent. He thought bin Laden was an idiot, more or less. He was a strategic ideologue calling for the long game, stochastic terrorism via social media, right on time in the name of global resistance. Now here's the quote. Deaths from global jihadi terror attacks in North America and Western Europe in the 5-year period from 2014 to 2018 numbered just under 400. Why, particularly with ISIS dispersal fighters, have there not been far more frequent of these attacks? That's my question.
Yeah, and it's a great question. In the case of North America, they're all every one that I can think of is a form of stochastic violence, so inspired individuals or small groups. In the case of Europe, it's a mix, right? Because it's much closer to the region, so there have been generally the more deadly attacks tend to be the ones organized by groups because they have the know-how, how to do it, the logistics, all of that. The inspired folks tend to be, just much less, have lower levels of competency in doing these things. But that was part of the point that I was trying to make in this, particularly in this fourth wave, is it will kill people, right? People will be murdered, are being murdered. It tends, though, we're better off right-sizing the threat, right? This is not an existential threat, and I think there are probably more important strategic threats in the world today. But it is a threat, so you want to right-size it and undertake appropriate policies given the nature and the level of the threat by comparison to other strategic threats or issues out in the world. And one other thing with Suri, Abu Musab Suri, he's kind of the favorite jihadi ideologue of Western scholars because he's self-critical, which you don't find very often. He's very critical of bin Laden. He thought it was a huge mistake. 9/11 was a huge mistake. In fact, he used, it's kind of a subtle dig, but if you're a jihadi, you know what he's talking about. He referred to bin Laden as a pharaoh. Right, so dictator, but it means more than that, right? In classic sort of 1970s jihadi Egyptian thought, the dichotomy was between Moses, a man of God's law, and Pharaoh, the man who made his own laws, right? Who was above God, who made himself God. So this was the sort of the good versus evil dichotomy in jihadi thought, way back when. And so Asuri calling bin Laden a pharaoh is a serious, serious dig at the man. Yeah, he thought bin Laden was an idiot. I think that's a fair assessment. He himself is this. He's very interesting, but in a very cold-blooded Machiavellian way. He would talk in his book about, you want to call me a terrorist? Fine, I'll take that. I'll take that label. But here's why I'm okay with it, and just kind of point A, point B, point C.
In the interest of staying on schedule, we can take only 20 more questions. 2 more, and then we're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this purely a Sunni phenomena that you're describing, the fourth wave? Is there no place for Shiites?
That's a great question, and the answer so far is yes. That in those first 2 stepping stones I talked about, the creation of Islamism and then jihadism in the 60s and 70s, there were parallel Sunni and Shia tracks. When it comes to global jihad, it's been an exclusively Sunni phenomenon. So then, well, why? I don't think there's any inherent reason why you couldn't have a Shia global jihadi movement or group. The way I try and understand and explain that lack of a Shia version of global jihad is that the state of Iran captures it, essentially. That radicalism, that muqawama, that resistance, and they actually don't use the word jihad, incidentally. The state of Iran, when they talk, they use the word muqawama. It's the same in Arabic and Farsi, of resistance as opposed to jihad, which is kind of interesting. But I think the state of Iran captures the kind of radicalism that might lead to a global jihad movement in the Shia world is essentially captured by Tehran, and so there's no oxygen left for any sort of significant independent Shia movement. But good observation, yeah.
Since this has been going on for many hundreds of years, waxes and wanes, as you've described, what do you see for wave 5?
Well, so I don't want you to leave here thinking that what I've described has been around for 500 years or 1,000 years. It hasn't, right? It's like Islamism itself is very much a 20th century phenomenon linked to the rise of mass society, colonialism, other modern phenomenon. This was a response to that. Global jihadism it was something that was born at the end of the Cold War from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then has had a bit of a life of its own ever since. So that's the first thing. To just recognize this is a pretty modern phenomenon, or contemporary phenomenon. The fifth wave, I'm not smart enough to think in the fifth wave. I think what you're seeing in terms of the durability of stochastic violence, I think there's a reason why violent folks in the world today have latched on to this form of violence, whether you're talking about white nationalists or jihadis or the next group that'll come along. Why? As for the reasons I've said, it's very durable. It's hard to stamp out. It's really difficult to stamp out. You can catch it in time sometimes, but to sort of, you can roll up a group, right? Al-Qaeda Central is defeated, right? It doesn't exist except for in the hearts of a couple of people anymore. And the franchises that people talk about they're overrated. Let me put it that way. So you can defeat groups. You can defeat states. You can defeat groups. And so that you just have some random individuals around anymore. This kind of violence, stochastic violence, is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to defeat. So I think it'll be around for a while.
Thank you, Glenn, very much.